My name is Sophia Miller, and I was 29 years old when the day I had dreamed of since childhood twisted into something I will never forget. The wedding hall glowed with chandeliers, the air carried the scent of roses and buttercream, and violins sang as I stood in my white dress, trembling with joy. Every guest was seated, the champagne was ready to be poured, and I felt for a fleeting moment that I had finally escaped years of being overlooked and dismissed. This day was supposed to prove that I belonged somewhere, that I was loved. But before I could even finish my vows, the woman who should have been welcoming me into her family rose from her chair and shattered everything. Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law, adjusted her pearl necklace, her smile tight, her eyes cold. She stepped into the silence, and her words cut across the hall like a knife. "This wedding is a mistake. She is cheap, unworthy, and a disgrace to our family name." The words landed harder than any object could. The violinist stopped. A fork clattered to the floor. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, the bride frozen in shame. Heat flushed across my chest and face as if my skin were on fire. I looked at James, my husband-to-be. His lips parted, but no words came. He just stared helplessly at his mother. The silence pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Then came the sound I will never erase. Margaret's heels struck the polished floor as she approached. Without hesitation, she raised her hand and struck my face with a sharp crack that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. My head snapped sideways. Pain spread across my cheek, hot and stinging, my eyes filling with tears. My veil shifted as lipstick smeared onto the fabric. For one long second, no one moved. I stood there stunned, a bride slapped by her mother-in-law in front of every witness on what should have been her sacred day. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another covered her mouth. The humiliation was unbearable. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. My heart hammered so loudly I could not hear the music anymore, only the echo of that slap replaying again and again. James reached for me, his hand trembling, but Margaret raised her palm once more as if daring him to try. Her voice came cold and sharp. "See? Weak. She does not belong here." Murmurs rippled through the guests. I tasted salt on my lips, tears mixed with fear. My chest tightened. It felt like drowning in front of an audience. Yet as the weight of her hand burned across my skin, something unexpected flickered inside me. Rage. A small ember glowing hotter with every second I stood there. Rage that this woman believed she could erase me with one public humiliation. Rage that my future husband stood frozen. Rage that my worth could be dismissed so easily. I did not know then how far that ember would grow, how bright it would blaze, but I knew one thing with piercing clarity. This wedding had just turned into a battlefield, and I would not leave it defeated. The sting on my cheek had barely begun to fade when Margaret's voice rose even sharper, cutting through the silence that had paralyzed the room. "Do you see it now? This woman is not fit to stand beside my son. She is beneath us. She is here only because she wants what she cannot earn on her own." My ears rang with every syllable. It was as though she had decided to turn my wedding day into a courtroom, and she was both the judge and the executioner. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but no one spoke. I could feel their eyes burning into me as if they were all silently agreeing with her accusations. The weight of their stares pressed into my skin, heavier than the veil draped across my shoulders. James stood stiff at my side, his hand hovering uncertainly but his mouth refusing to form words. Margaret saw his hesitation and seized it as an opening. "Look at him. He cannot even defend her because he knows I am right. He knows she will drag him down and stain our family's reputation." My throat closed. I wanted to scream that none of this was true, that I had worked for everything I ever had, that I had loved James without conditions. But the words died inside me, strangled by the humiliation. The guests began to murmur, a cousin whispering too loudly. "She is not even from a wealthy family," and an aunt echoing, "She will only drain him dry." Each sentence was a blade sinking deeper into my chest. My hands trembled around the bouquet. The roses blurred through the tears gathering in my eyes. Margaret smirked at the sight. "Look at her shaking," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "She cannot even hold herself together for one afternoon. And this is the woman we are supposed to trust with the Carter name." The blow of her palm had humiliated me, but these words gutted me. They stripped me bare in front of every witness. I heard the sound of someone's laughter, low and cruel, and it cut worse than the slap. My father-in-law remained seated, his face stone cold, as if nothing had happened, as if the shame poured over me had no weight at all. It was silence that condemned me the most. Not one person stood up. Not one friend of the family spoke in my defense. The silence was louder than Margaret's insults because it told me I was alone. James finally whispered, "Mom, stop," but his voice was so weak it dissolved before it reached her. Margaret's eyes narrowed triumphantly. "Do not tell me to stop when I am saving you. Do you not see what is happening here? She is trying to tie herself to our name, to our wealth, to everything we built. That is her only value." I pressed my lips together hard, trying to keep them from trembling, but the taste of salt from tears and the faint metallic tang from where her slap had broken the skin reminded me of my place. The veil clung damp against my cheek, and I wanted nothing more than to tear it off and run, yet my feet would not move. Gasps rippled again when Margaret raised her hand once more, not striking this time, but hovering in the air like a threat. See how easily she crumbles. One word, one gesture, and she falls apart. A woman like this will never last. She will never be strong enough for this family. My eyes darted across the room, searching for one sympathetic face. One hand reaching out, one guest willing to say, "This is wrong." But all I saw were lowered gazes and folded hands. A cousin sipped his wine, pretending to be distracted. An aunt looked down at her lap. The betrayal of their silence crushed me more than Margaret's slap. It told me that no matter what she did, no matter how cruel the power she held, was greater than any sense of justice they might have had. James finally stepped forward, trying to shield me, but Margaret snapped his name like a whip. "James, do not be a fool. Do not throw away everything for her. You will regret it." And in that moment his body froze again, and he looked torn between me and the woman who had raised him. The cold realization settled in my chest. If I was to survive this, it would not be because he found his voice. It would only be because I found mine. When I was a little girl, I believed families were meant to be safe places where love came without condition. I learned quickly that this was not true in my home. I was born the first child of two working-class parents in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My father worked long hours at a machine shop, and my mother balanced part-time jobs in the house. For the first 2 years of my life, I was the center of their world. There are a few faded photographs of me in a pink dress on my 2nd birthday, candles glowing, my mother smiling. But the moment my younger brother Ryan was born, everything shifted. It was as though the spotlight swung from me to him and never came back. I remember being 7 years old, sitting on the porch with a second-hand sweater for my birthday, while inside my parents clapped and cheered because Ryan had scribbled his name for the first time. They called him a genius while I sat clutching my worn sweater, wondering why no one cared that my report card had straight A's. That pattern never stopped. Every effort I made was invisible. Every stumble Ryan made was celebrated as if it proved he was destined for greatness. When he moved up a grade, my parents bought him a shiny red bicycle. When I asked to join a summer science program after finishing top of my class, the answer was, "No, maybe next year, sweetheart, we cannot afford it." But somehow there was always enough money for Ryan's soccer cleats or his weekend trips with friends. I would watch him ride his bike down the street while I sat with a library book, dreaming of a world where achievement mattered more than charm. The favoritism became the air I breathed. At 14, the bedrooms were switched. Ryan got the larger one with 2 windows and space for a television. I was moved into the small room with peeling wallpaper. My father explained that boys needed more space to grow. I nodded, but my chest burned. I studied on a cramped desk while Ryan filled his room with posters and friends. At recitals, my flawless piano performances earned polite claps while his clumsy soccer kicks drew cheers like he had won the World Cup. Even at church gatherings, my mother beamed about Ryan's charm while brushing me off as the dependable one. Over time, I absorbed the message. I was the supporting act in my own home. By the time I was 18, I had worked relentlessly at school and was accepted into a state university with partial scholarships. I should have been overjoyed, but my father lost his job at the auto plant that same year. Our finances collapsed. My mother's receptionist job could barely cover groceries. The focus turned to survival. And instead of being the child receiving help, I became the helper. I took on 3 jobs waitressing in the mornings, working at the campus library in the afternoons, and doing data entry at night. I averaged 4 hours of sleep, but kept going. I believed if I just endured long enough, I would build a better future. Meanwhile, Ryan coasted through high school with average grades, but still got a car my father co-signed for and new sports gear every season. My parents told me, "You will manage Sophia, you are strong." To Ryan, they said, "You deserve the best." The injustice carved deep lines inside me. Still, I pushed on, fueled by determination, and maybe by the faint hope that one day they would see me. 4 years later, I graduated with a degree in education. It should have been my moment, but it felt hollow. I walked across the stage and saw my parents clapping politely while Ryan fiddled on his phone. They took me out for dinner, but spent most of it discussing Ryan's new girlfriend. That was when the truth solidified. I would never be their star. I would always be the one who carried weight without applause. The lesson of my childhood was cruel but clear. If I wanted recognition, I would never find it under my parents' roof. That lesson shaped every choice I made afterward, including the way I fell in love with James Carter. I met James Carter when I was 24 years old and already exhausted from the constant balancing act of working full-time as a new teacher while still sending money home to help my parents cover their bills. He was volunteering at a community reading program where I had been asked to bring some of my students for an after-school event. James was tall with a gentle smile, and he knelt beside a boy struggling to sound out words with such patience that I stopped to watch. We talked after the session ended, and his voice carried an ease that I had rarely known. He asked about my work and actually listened to my answer. No one in my family had ever listened to me like that. For months afterward, we saw each other at similar events, then coffee, then dinners. James was kind, steady, and dependable. He worked as an engineer and carried himself with quiet confidence. For the first time in my life, I felt chosen. He did not care that my car was old or that my apartment was small. He admired my determination and the way I talked about my students. With him, I began to believe I might finally build a life not defined by favoritism and neglect. But with James came Margaret. The first time he introduced me to his mother, I sensed the warning signs. Margaret's handshake was cool, and her eyes swept over me like a scanner measuring my worth and finding it lacking. She smiled at James, but her lips tightened when she turned back to me. "A schoolteacher," she said, as though it were a disappointment. How quaint? I laughed it off in the moment, but inside I felt the sting. From then on, every dinner, every visit carried the same undertone. Margaret would ask about my salary with feigned politeness, comment on how James deserved someone who could support his ambitions, or make passive remarks about women who hold men back. James would shift uncomfortably but rarely challenge her. He loved his mother deeply, and I understood that, but her power over him was undeniable. When James and I moved in together, Margaret insisted on seeing the lease. She argued that his name should come first. She asked whether I was contributing equally, as if my worth could be measured in dollar amounts. At holidays, she found subtle ways to undermine me. If I brought a dish, she critiqued it loudly. If I tried to join conversations, she redirected attention to James. The pattern was painfully familiar. It echoed the home I had grown up in, where I had learned to swallow pride and keep quiet. Yet now the stakes were different. I was no longer a child. I was a woman who wanted to build a family of her own. Still, I tried. I told myself that love was worth the struggle, that Margaret's attitude might soften if she saw my devotion to her son. I cooked for James when he worked late. I supported him when projects at his firm dragged into the night. I planned thoughtful surprises for birthdays. But Margaret always found a way to twist things. She told James one evening in front of me, "You need a partner who lifts you up, not one who drains you with her own burdens." The words landed like stones. James protested weakly, but Margaret's eyes bored into me with triumph. There were times when I thought about leaving, about sparing myself the humiliation. But each time, James would hold me and whisper that he loved me, that he wanted a future with me, and the ache in my chest would ease. I wanted to believe that love was enough. I wanted to believe that Margaret's power would not crush us. Yet piece by piece, she tightened her grip. When James received a promotion, she threw a lavish dinner party and introduced him to every guest as her brilliant son. When someone asked about me, she waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, Sophia teaches children. It is sweet, really." I smiled through clenched teeth the same way I had smiled at my parents' applause for Ryan. The script was the same, only the cast had changed. By the time James proposed to me on a quiet evening in our apartment with candles and trembling hands, I already knew Margaret would never truly accept me. But I said yes because for once, the choice was mine, because I loved him, and because deep down I hoped I could stand tall against the storm. The months after our engagement should have been filled with excitement and planning, but instead they were overshadowed by Margaret's constant interference. From the moment James announced the news to his family, she seized control. She insisted on hosting dinners where she spoke at length about how the wedding should look, who should be invited, and what traditions must be followed. Every suggestion I made was brushed aside. When I said I wanted a modest ceremony filled with friends and personal touches, Margaret scoffed. "A Carter wedding must reflect our status," she declared. "It is not about your preferences, it is about our family's image." James tried to compromise, but Margaret always pressed harder until my voice disappeared in the noise. The financial aspect became her next weapon. She demanded to see budgets, criticized my savings, and told James that a woman who brought little money into a marriage was a liability. I earned a steady income as a teacher, but in her eyes it was laughable. One evening, she cornered James in front of me and asked whether he had considered a prenuptial agreement. She framed it as protection, but the implication was clear. She believed I was after his money. I wanted to scream, but James, torn between loyalty and love, said softly that maybe it was worth discussing. My heart cracked at those words. I felt as though the years I had fought to prove myself meant nothing. Margaret smirked at my silence, satisfied with the doubt she had planted. Family dinners grew unbearable. Margaret criticized everything from the way I held my fork to the clothes I wore. At Thanksgiving, when I brought homemade pies, she tasted one and announced loudly to the table that it was too sweet, then turned to her guests with a smile as if sharing a harmless joke. I forced a laugh while my stomach knotted. At Christmas, she gave James expensive cufflinks and handed me a cookbook with a pointed remark that maybe this would help. The guests chuckled. I swallowed my humiliation like medicine. Each event became another performance where she pulled the strings, and I played the role of the inadequate outsider. James noticed, but his attempts to stop her were weak. He loved me, but he feared upsetting his mother. That tension became the constant third presence in our relationship. My friend Rachel was the only one who saw clearly. She had been with me since college and knew the scars of my childhood favoritism. Over wine one evening, she looked me in the eye and said, "Sophia, she will never accept you. She thrives on control. If you marry James without boundaries, you will spend the rest of your life begging for scraps of respect." I defended him, insisting that love could overcome it, that Margaret would soften once she saw our devotion. Rachel shook her head. "Toxic people do not soften. They escalate." Her words haunted me, but I was too afraid to let them in. I had already invested too much hope into the idea that this marriage would give me the family I had always longed for. Yet, Margaret escalated exactly as Rachel predicted. She called James late at night to complain about me, accusing me of manipulating him. She showed up at our apartment uninvited, rearranging the kitchen and criticizing my choices. When I tried to protest, she said coldly, "I am just teaching you how things are done properly." Her presence filled every corner of our lives. My dreams of a joyful engagement turned into months of quiet endurance. I convinced myself that once the wedding happened, things would settle, that Margaret would finally step back. But beneath that fragile hope, a darker awareness grew. I was repeating the same cycle I had lived as a child. Just as my parents had ignored my worth and praised Ryan for mediocrity, Margaret dismissed my sacrifices and glorified James. I had exchanged one stage for another, but the script was unchanged. And this time, the consequences were heavier because the stage was a marriage, the most public vow of my life. As the wedding approached, the weight of Margaret's control grew heavier until it pressed on every choice we tried to make. She inserted herself into every meeting with planners, dismissing my suggestions for flowers, for music, for the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. Each time she would tilt her head and say with a condescending smile, "That is cute, dear, but not appropriate for a Carter wedding." I wanted to fight back, but James always squeezed my hand under the table and whispered later as if later ever came. The invitations became another battlefield. I wanted a small circle of friends and family who knew us. Margaret demanded a list twice as long, filled with business associates, distant relatives, and people I had never met. She said a wedding was not about what we wanted, but about what it represented. When I protested, she cut me off sharply. "Do not embarrass yourself, Sophia. We are giving you an opportunity. You should be grateful." Her words sliced deeper than I expected because they echoed the very same tone my parents had used when I was young. Be grateful. Accept less. Work harder for scraps of acknowledgement. It was the chorus of my life, and now it followed me into the one event that should have belonged to me. Financial strain added to the pressure. My modest teacher's salary meant I had to budget carefully, yet Margaret insisted on extravagance. She offered to pay for certain vendors, but only if she approved every detail. That money became another leash around my neck. If I resisted, she threatened to withdraw support and accuse me of ruining James's special day. James tried to soothe me by saying it was only for now, that once the wedding was over, we would have peace. But I felt the truth gnawing inside. This was not temporary. This was the foundation of our life if we allowed it. In the weeks before the ceremony, Margaret's hostility sharpened into cruelty. At a family gathering, she announced in front of everyone that she had considered hiring a stylist for me because I clearly had no idea how to present myself. Laughter rippled around the table. I forced a smile while my cheeks burned. That night, Rachel came over and found me crying into my hands. "Sophia," she said softly, "you are walking into a war zone. Are you sure you want this?" I shook my head but whispered that I loved James, that I could not abandon him. Rachel looked at me with pity. "Love is not enough when someone else holds the strings." Her warning haunted me as the days counted down. The night before the wedding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, unable to breathe. My parents had called to say they could not help with any expenses. Ryan had borrowed money again, and here I was about to pledge myself into a family where I was already unwanted. Doubt clawed at me, but I pushed it down. I told myself I had survived worse, that if I endured long enough, Margaret might grow tired of her battle. I told myself that James's love would shield me, yet deep down I knew the storm was only gathering. When the morning came and I slipped into my dress, the lace delicate against my skin, I whispered to my reflection that I would smile through the day no matter what. I had no idea that before the vows were even complete, Margaret would stand up, raise her voice, and then raise her hand, turning all of my quiet endurance into fuel for an eruption I could no longer contain. The sting of Margaret's slap still burned across my cheek, my bouquet trembling in my hands, my veil damp with tears when I realized the entire hall had become a stage and I was cast as the humiliated bride. Every guest's eyes bore into me, some wide with shock, others lowered in cowardice, all of them witnessing my ruin. For a moment, I felt myself shrinking. The same small girl who had once clutched a second-hand sweater while her brother paraded on a new bicycle. I wanted to flee, to let the ground swallow me, to surrender the fight and accept that this day belonged not to me, but to Margaret. My lips quivered, my chest heaved, and I tasted the metallic edge of blood where her hand had split my skin. But then, through the suffocating shame, something shifted. I remembered every night I had worked myself to exhaustion while my family dismissed me. I remembered every meal where Margaret's words had cut me down and James had sat in silence. I remembered Rachel's warning that love would not be enough if I let Margaret keep her grip. A tremor of anger sparked in my stomach, faint at first, then growing with every breath I took. Margaret had tried to silence me with a slap, but instead she had awakened something fiercer. My body shook, but not with fear now, with a surge of defiance I had never felt so strongly. Slowly, I lowered the bouquet to the floor, the roses slipping from my grip, and the sound of their stems brushing the marble was sharp in the stillness. The guests leaned forward as if sensing a change. I lifted my head. My cheek throbbed red, but my eyes locked on Margaret's with a steadiness that made her falter for a fraction of a second. My voice, when it came, was trembling yet clear enough to carry across the hall. If today is about truth, then let us speak the whole truth. The silence deepened, every breath in the room held, as if the air itself feared to move. Margaret sneered, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. She had expected me to cower, to collapse, not to rise. James, whispered Sophia, but I raised a hand to quiet him. This was mine to fight. For years I had swallowed humiliation. For years I had convinced myself that if I endured long enough, respect would follow. But standing there, bleeding in front of them all, I knew the truth. Respect never comes to those who beg for it. It comes to those who demand it. My voice grew steadier. You think I am weak because I cry, because I shake, because I love. But I am not weak. I have carried burdens that would break others. I have given when no one gave back. And I have seen enough of lies to know the truth when I hold it. Murmurs stirred in the crowd. Margaret's face tightened, her hand twitching as though she might strike again, but the power of the moment had shifted. The heat of humiliation that had burned me moments ago was cooling into the steel of resolve. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and let the weight of silence work for me instead of against me. Margaret said coldly, "You dare threaten me here on this day in front of everyone." I met her glare. "No," I said, "I dare tell the truth." That was the moment I stopped being the victim of her narrative and began writing my own. The words had barely left my mouth when a ripple of unease moved through the crowd, guests shifting in their seats, whispers rising like wind before a storm. Margaret's eyes narrowed and she hissed, "Careful, Sophia, you do not know who you are dealing with." But I did know. I had known for months, ever since the day she left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter during one of her surprise visits. I had not meant to pry, but when the screen lit up with a message that began with, "I missed last night," curiosity had given way to shock. I scrolled through a thread of messages that left no doubt. Margaret, the woman who paraded her image of perfection, who sneered at me for not being worthy of the Carter name, had been living a double life with a man who was not her husband. At first, I kept the secret locked away, unsure what to do, but as she escalated her cruelty, the knowledge burned hotter inside me. After the slap, after the humiliation, I knew the time had come. I lifted my chin and said loudly enough for every guest to hear, "You call me cheap, unworthy, a disgrace. But tell me, Margaret, what would everyone here think if they knew the truth about you?" Her face paled, though her smile remained fixed. "Lies," she spat. "You have nothing." I took a deep breath, reached into the pocket of my dress where I had tucked my phone, and with trembling fingers unlocked the screen. The projector that had been set up for the evening slideshows was still connected. I tapped, and the screen behind me lit up bright against the dimmed hall. Gasps erupted as text messages filled the wall. Messages of longing, of hotel rooms, of late-night rendezvous, signed with hearts and promises. Margaret lunged forward, shouting, "This is fake! This is fabricated!" But the evidence spoke louder than her denials. My father-in-law's face drained of color as he stared at the words, his hands shaking. The guests erupted into shocked murmurs, some covering their mouths, others exchanging horrified looks. One aunt whispered, "Dear Lord," another muttered, "She dared to shame her daughter-in-law when she carried this herself." James staggered back, as if struck, his eyes darting between me and his mother, confusion and betrayal twisting across his face. He whispered, "Mom, is this true?" Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came. She reached for the phone, desperate to erase the truth, but I held it high and said, "Do not touch me again." The crowd stilled, waiting. I let my voice carry. "You humiliated me in front of every guest. You called me unworthy. But here is the truth. The woman who slapped me in my wedding gown, who has called me a disgrace since the day we met, is the same woman who has betrayed her vows for years. Gasps cut through the air. Margaret shook her head, tears welling her voice breaking as she cried, "I did it because your father was distant, because I was lonely." But the excuses were drowned out by the weight of the room. My father-in-law rose slowly, his face pale, his body trembling. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice hollow. Margaret sputtered, tried to deny, then crumbled into sobs. The image of her perfect reputation shattered in real time, witnessed by every guest she had invited to prove the strength of her family. My hands still shook. My cheek still stung, but for the first time I felt powerful. The shame that had suffocated me only moments ago slid off my shoulders and landed where it belonged. I turned to the crowd, my voice steady now. "You all saw what happened here today. You saw her raise her hand against me. You heard her words. And now you know the truth she tried to hide. I am not the disgrace. She is." The hall erupted into whispers, some supportive, some scandalized. Cameras on phones clicked as people captured the spectacle. Margaret collapsed into her chair. Hair, disheveled tears streaking her face, the pearl necklace gleaming like a cruel joke. James pressed his palms to his temples, his world cracking open. I looked at him waiting, but he said nothing. The silence was his answer. My heart twisted, but I did not falter. I stepped back from the altar, lifted my head, and said, "If money, status, and appearances are all that make me family, then I want no part of it. If truth is what it takes to belong, then I stand in it alone." With that, I turned and walked down the aisle, the long white gown trailing behind me, not as a bride walking toward a husband, but as a woman walking out of a cage. Each step was heavy, yet liberating. Guests parted silently as I passed some, reaching out with murmurs of sympathy, others averting their eyes. At the doors, I paused, feeling the weight of every gaze, then pushed them open and let the cold air wash over me. Behind me, the hall was chaos, voices rising, reputations crumbling. Ahead of me was only uncertainty, but at least it was mine. The slap had humiliated me. The exposure had freed me. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, and the night air struck my face cool against the sting of Margaret's slap. I stood on the steps in my wedding gown, my chest heaving as though I had just fought a war. Inside the hall, the chaos rose louder. Voices shouting, chairs scraping, glasses shattering. I heard James calling my name, but I did not turn back. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing, tears spilling, though they were no longer only tears of pain. They were the tears of release. I had walked away from the battlefield still standing. For the next hour, I sat in the back of Rachel's Carvale, tossed aside mascara streaked down my cheeks. She held my hand as I shook and whispered over and over, "You did it, Sophia. You finally did it." My phone buzzed constantly with calls from unknown numbers, family members, even reporters who had already gotten wind of the scandal. I turned it off. I needed silence more than explanations. Meanwhile, inside, the Carter family's world crumbled. Word spread like wildfire across town. Guests left in stunned silence, some whispering about Margaret's hypocrisy, others about the image of a bride slapped by her mother-in-law. By morning, it was on social media, a clip from someone's phone showing Margaret's hand striking my cheek. Then, my voice carrying across the room as the texts appeared on the projector. The video spread fast, comments pouring in condemning her cruelty. For a woman who had lived her life obsessed with appearances, it was the ultimate punishment. The Carter name, once spoken with respect in their community, became synonymous with scandal. James tried to call me dozens of times in the days that followed, but I could not answer. I did not know whether I wanted to forgive his silence. Margaret sent messages first, furious, accusing me of lies and manipulation, then pitiful, begging me to retract, insisting her life was ruined. My father-in-law reached out quietly, saying he had moved into a hotel and did not know what to believe anymore. I felt pity for him, but no desire to step back into that house of control. Rachel kept me grounded. She reminded me that what I had done was not cruelty, it was survival. Yet survival did not erase the ache. At night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the slap, the whispers, the way James had looked at me torn, but silent. That silence cut deeper than Margaret's hand. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout only grew. Margaret resigned from 2 committees where she had once basked in respect. Neighbors whispered when she walked down the street. Former friends avoided her calls. James confessed in a message that his firm had started treating him differently, not because of his work, but because of the shame attached to his mother's actions. He said he loved me, begged me to talk, but I read the words with numbness. Love without courage was not enough. Meanwhile, strangers wrote to me online. Some women told me they had endured the same humiliation from toxic in-laws and that my stand had given them strength. Others told me I was brave, that walking away from a wedding took more courage than staying in a broken family. Their voices reminded me I was not alone. And yet there were moments when guilt tugged at me, whispering that I had destroyed a family. But then I remembered Margaret's palm against my face, her words, cheap, unworthy disgrace, and I knew the destruction had begun long before I exposed her. I had not destroyed them. I had simply ended their illusion. The Carter family name no longer glowed, but I finally did not carry the weight of proving my worth. The aftermath was brutal, messy, public, but in that storm, I found something I had never known before: freedom. In the weeks after the wedding, I drifted through my days like a ghost carrying the weight of humiliation and the strange lightness of liberation at the same time. My apartment became both sanctuary and prison. I pulled the curtains closed to keep out curious neighbors who had seen the video, but at night I lit candles and sat in silence, feeling for the first time that this space belonged entirely to me. Rachel visited often, bringing takeout and wine, refusing to let me disappear completely. One evening she placed her hand on mine and said, "Sophia, you need help beyond me. You need to talk to someone who can untangle years of wounds." I resisted at first, claiming I was fine, but the nightmares told me otherwise. I dreamed of Margaret's hand flying toward my face, of James's silence, of my parents' indifference years earlier. I woke with my heart pounding and tears on my pillow. Finally, I agreed. I began therapy with a woman named Dr. Harris who specialized in family trauma. The first session I could barely speak, choking on shame, but she was patient. She asked me to describe my earliest memories of being unseen, and I found myself back on that porch at 7 years old with a sweater in my lap while Ryan rode his new bicycle. I cried as I admitted how deeply I had believed my worth was tied to sacrifice. Week after week, she guided me through the maze of my past. She said softly, "Sophia, you were conditioned to think love must be earned with pain, but that was never true." Those words cracked something open in me. Slowly, I began to see that my tolerance of Margaret's cruelty was not weakness, it was learned survival. In therapy, I allowed myself to feel anger I had buried for years. I raged about my parents, about James, about Margaret. I wrote letters I never sent, pouring out every unsaid word. Each session stripped away another layer of guilt until I began to breathe easier. At the same time, I joined a support group for adult children of toxic families. Sitting in a circle of strangers, I heard stories that echoed my own favoritism, gaslighting, financial exploitation. The recognition was healing. I was not crazy. I was not alone. Meanwhile, life continued to unravel for the Carters. Rachel showed me articles about Margaret stepping down from social boards, rumors of divorce swirling, James moving out of the family home. He sent me messages begging for another chance, claiming he finally saw how destructive his mother was, but my chest ached each time I read them. Love without action is only words, and on the day I needed him most, he had stood still. I chose not to answer. Instead, I turned my energy inward. I decorated my apartment with plants that thrived in sunlight, with art that reflected my spirit, with colors that made me smile. For the first time, I spent money on myself without guilt. I booked a weekend trip to Chicago, walking the same streets I once paid for my parents to visit, and I savored every meal, every laugh, every quiet moment, knowing it was mine. Healing was not linear. Some nights I still cried. Some mornings I woke heavy with doubt, but gradually, laughter returned to my voice and peace settled into my bones. Dr. Harris reminded me that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. I practiced saying no. I stopped answering calls from family members who only reached out to demand. I said yes to Rachel's invitations, yes to long walks, yes to naps without apology. In early fall, I met Michael, an architect introduced by a mutual friend. On our third date over dinner, I confessed the truth of my broken wedding, expecting judgment or pity. He simply reached across the table and said, "Family is who treats you like you matter." His words sank into me like sunlight. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe I deserved love without conditions. By the time Thanksgiving came again, I was not seated at a table of contempt. I hosted a small dinner in my apartment with Rachel, with a few supportive relatives, like my cousin Natalie, who had written me messages of encouragement, and with Michael. We laughed, we toasted, and when they raised their glasses to me, I felt a warmth I had never felt in my parents' house or the Carters' Hall. In that moment, I realized healing was not forgetting. Healing was refusing to return to places where my worth was denied. It was building something new on my own terms. When I look back on that day in the wedding hall, the roses, the music, the guests dressed in their finest, I no longer see it as the moment my life was ruined. I see it as the moment I was finally set free. Margaret thought that by shaming me, by striking me in front of everyone, she would silence me forever. She thought I would shrink, cower, and disappear under the weight of humiliation. Instead, that slap became the spark that ignited my voice. She believed she was exposing me as unworthy, but in truth, I exposed her for what she really was. For years, I had carried the burden of proving myself, of begging to be seen first with my parents, and then with James's family. I bent, I sacrificed, I endured, always hoping that if I gave enough, they would finally open their arms. That day taught me a lesson I should have learned long before. Real family is not defined by blood, by rings, or by names written on invitations. Real family are the people who see you as you are and do not ask you to shrink to fit their comfort. Real family do not slap you when you stand in your truth. They hold you when you tremble. They lift you when you stumble. They fight beside you when storms come. Margaret lost everything that day, not because I destroyed her, but because she revealed herself. And James lost me, not because I stopped loving him, but because he stopped standing with me. My story is painful, but it is also a warning. Do not wait for toxic people to soften. Do not bleed yourself dry, hoping they will notice your sacrifice. They will not. The moment you allow yourself to see clearly is the moment you can walk away, even if it means walking out of a wedding hall in a torn gown with tears streaking your face. That walk was the hardest I ever made, yet it was also the most important. Today, I carry no pearl necklace, no Carter name, no desperate hope of earning love that was never real. What I carry instead is peace, self-respect, and the certainty that I am worthy of love without conditions. If you hear my story and see yourself in it, know this. You are not weak for enduring, but you are strong for leaving. Do not let anyone convince you that silence is loyalty. Silence is surrender. Speak even if your voice trembles. Walk away even if your knees shake. And remember, sometimes the greatest gift a toxic family can give you is the moment they finally reveal themselves, because in that moment they hand you the key to your own freedom.